Regulation. Today's show is called Crypto and Politics. The 2024 elections showdown will cover crypto's growing spotlight in the upcoming elections with our guest Vivek Ramaswamy. And after that, we'll talk about NFTs. They are back in the headlines again, but this time from a regulatory perspective. I'm Jen Sanasie. I'm here with my co-host, former federal prosecutor and partner at Paul Hastings, Renato Mariotti. Renato, so lovely to see you again.
Great to see you again. We need to get to our guest. He's waiting in the green room. We need to bring him in.
We got to get to our guest. We don't have a lot of time with him. Vivek Ramaswamy was speaking at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville last weekend. He joins us now for this Twitter Live to chat about crypto as we head into the elections in November. Vivek, welcome.
Hey, good to talk to you for a few minutes.
Yeah, good to talk to you too. So let's get right down to brass tacks. You were at the conference last weekend. You were there with Trump. Talk to me about the reception from the crypto community. I know that it's been smooth sailing for Trump so far when it comes to crypto.
Well, the reason it's been smooth sailing is he's had actually intelligent things to say, which differentiates him from the other major candidate in the race. And I'm incredibly proud of President Trump, actually, who I've gotten to know particularly well in the last 7-8 months, in the 7 months since I left the presidential race this January. I've known him before as well. But one of the things I have really learned about him is he is somebody who is open to learning about new issues that he didn't know about in the past with humility and without trying to pretend like he knew everything all along anyway, which makes him very different than other politicians. And so, as he mentioned in his speech at the Bitcoin conference, I feel comfortable saying it. He and I have had some great conversations on the subject matter here, but it's on the basis of first principles. It's not that it's a matter of standing for another new industry. It's a matter of standing for the principles that the United States of America was founded on, which is financial freedom and choice, and a government that is limited in the power that it exercises by our constitutional system of checks and balances, not an administrative state that runs amok. And those principles happen to actually, when applied, be quite favorable to the flourishing of a new industry, if we're to call it that, both in the areas of crypto and Bitcoin. So I thought it was a productive conference. I think it is telling that you haven't seen a thoughtful crypto policy framework, whatever it is. Maybe if it's in one we disagree with, at least some framework offered by the new Kamala Harris-led ticket. I would like to make a prediction. I'm wrong about some of my predictions, but I'd like to think right more often than I'm wrong over the last year and a half. I think you're going to see some type of reactionary, I believe it's going to be thin and possibly hollow, democratic alternative for what a crypto policy framework looks like. And all I would encourage people to do is to measure that against the actual actions taken by much of the Democratic Party. And I think voters are smart enough to determine for themselves who they think is actually making authentic commitments that they're going to keep. But either way, I think this is going to be great for the sector, the type of intelligent conversation we're having in the policy realm that we weren't having even as recently as a year or two ago.
We haven't heard from Harris yet when it comes specifically to crypto policy. I recently spoke to Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna, who, has a lot of similar views. I think you and I spoke last year about your crypto policy. He really wants to push crypto forward. He says that he's going to talk to Harris. There are other Congress people who are Democrats who understand crypto. If they are advising Harris and she comes out with similar policies, she seems to really get it. Do you think that from a crypto perspective matters? Do you think that Trump will be able to maintain this momentum?
Look, that's a political analytical commentary. I'm not a horse race analyst. I have my visions on policy. I ran for US president with my own vision for this country. And so I'm not a horse race analyst. But what I will say from just wearing my business hat is, if what you said is actually true, that's just likely to be good for innovators in your sector more broadly. A thoughtful approach from policymakers on both sides, I don't think it should be a partisan set of issues anyway, is strictly good. Moving away actually from the realm of politics, but to wear my maybe business analysis hat a little bit. And my background was as an entrepreneur before running for president. I think one of the things you're likely to see is actually the evolution of crypto becoming part of just the ordinary portfolio allocation of mainstream everyday Americans because of this policy discourse. So the fact that you're having thoughtful policy discourse, and regardless of who wins the election, I think you're going to see some movement on this set of issues. That, I think, has the potential to really mainstream, if you will, crypto in the portfolio allocations of everyday Americans. And I think this is interesting because that's a cultural shift, right? If you think about the 80 plus million people who were supporting Donald Trump, probably many more than that as of the election this November, most of them have either no idea what cryptocurrency is, and certainly even more of them don't have any exposure to crypto in their portfolios. And one of the things when I look at the landscape, you see is a lot of the innovation is internal to the people who are already playing in the existent marketplace, better rails, better technology, but for a very small audience and user base. And I think the missing market structure right now, something that's missing in the marketplace, is who are the private sector actors, the wealth managers, the financial institutions that are actually taking some view on what crypto allocation needs to be to the masses. That's missing today. But I predict after this election, we're going to see more of that come into existence just because of the thoughtful policy discourse. It's now going to be on the minds of everyday Americans. Donald Trump is talking about it as a policy priority for a lot of Donald Trump's voter base and a lot of the followers of the America First movement to say that, okay, this is now something that I have not only permission to engage with, if you will, but even have an interest in understanding if I'm missing something that should be part of a well-balanced portfolio that's not. And I think that's actually missing in the nascent crypto and Bitcoin economy, is it's been so inward focused in terms of the innovation that the next frontier of real value creation, I think, is going to be whatever set of firms aren't built within crypto, but outside of the crypto landscape that take crypto exposure and Bitcoin exposure, to the masses, not in some sort of own it all and go all in type of strategy that you'll see from many people in the internal to the world of crypto, but actually a broader strategy of just saying what percentage of a standard portfolio allocation should it represent, whether that's 1% or whether it's 2%, a small portion of a well-balanced portfolio. That, I think, is actually what we're more likely to see over the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years because of the shift in the policy landscape, regardless of which side wins and regardless of which policies we see enacted, which I think is interesting from a business standpoint and standpoint of opportunities for entrepreneurs that are looking for the next frontier really is.
I know we don't have a lot of time, so I want to ask you about something that was said at the conference. I wasn't there. I read this as part of the transcript that was published on CoinDesk. Trump said, "I've heard from Vivek, 175 million people in some form are involved with this world of crypto and Bitcoin, and all of the others, 175 million. So when they heard that, they said, let's be nice to them, at least until after the election." I've seen some people point to that part, at least until after the election. Can you give us any insight there? I know you spend a lot of time with Trump. I know that you and him have spoken about crypto. Is he really adamant about this industry, or is it something that he's using as part of the election, and maybe after the election we're not going to see as much movement on some of the promises ahead of November?
So to be clear, did you watch the speech yourself?
I did watch parts of the speech, but I wasn't
I'd encourage you to just watch the whole thing, because that part that you quoted is actually the context of what he was referring to. Was a lot of the regulatory backlash has been aggressive. And what he's saying is a lot of those regulatory actors are saying, let's be nice to them until the election. That's what he was saying. So it's worth actually just getting the context of what he was referring to. He wasn't referring to let's be nice to them like his campaign. He's saying that's what a lot of the regulators have effectively been saying, to play it nice until the election, until they see who actually wins. That was the context of the quote. And so for people who are interested in the speech, watch the speech. But to your question of does he actually mean the commitments, the policy commitments he's put on offer? I believe he does, actually. And I say this as somebody who talked to him in January of this year, for example, about what has since become a steadfast opposition to the adoption of a central bank digital currency in the United States. That was a core commitment I made early on in my campaign on first principles, because that's important to me. But I'll tell you, when I shared that with Donald Trump, it wasn't that, oh, how's that polling and let me include it in my speeches. That wasn't the tenor of our conversation, actually. In New Hampshire, I remember multiple discussions I had with him. The questions he asked me is, okay, why are the people who are in favor of it then? Okay, tell me what the actual risks and downsides are. And he didn't adopt his position immediately. He waited. He took his time. And when he made his commitment, it was when he was ready to make his commitment. He and I spoke as well in the lead up to his speech, which I thought was an outstanding speech, at the Libertarian Convention, where he actually laid out some more substantive policy proposals as well. Again, that wasn't just okay, I'm going to say it because someone told me to say it. There was a lot of back and forth. He's incredibly intellectually curious about this set of issues and thoughtful about it. And so, I'm not running for president anymore, but you're asking me from my perspective, knowing well the person who is. Does he actually mean the commitments that he made at that conference? Absolutely, actually. And I think one way to double click on that a little bit, for those who are skeptical, and I'm always a fan of people being skeptical of politicians, but for those who are skeptical, I would actually take a look at how restrained a couple of those commitments were. A couple of the commitments were really forward, really express. In a couple of cases, he exhibited restraint too, where he's talking to a very pro-Bitcoin friendly audience. And there was a lot of pressure on him about the idea of having a national strategic reserve of Bitcoin. But what he said was pretty measured. He said that the Bitcoin that the government already holds through seizures, that would be the beginning of a reserve. Not that it was going to go into the open market necessarily and start buying, even though that would have been the pandering thing to say to the audience. So to know that in that same speech, there are some things that he could have said that obviously were being teed up by others in that community for him to say that would have been successful as a matter of short-term pandering. He didn't choose that path. And so even for those who are skeptical, I think that that's a good mark, at least, of, certainly it's my opinion, my firm opinion, that he really means the commitments that he made at that conference. And regardless, I think that from the standpoint of your sector, I do predict that the Democrats are going to come out with some sort of reaction that they otherwise wouldn't have come out with, because Donald Trump laid out the specific policy commitments he did at that conference. For your sector and for your community, that's great, right? And whether the Democrats mean it or not, I think should be a question that we're as asked when for this long they haven't offered policy commitments. And if they do in response to Donald Trump, I think there'll be some basis for questioning the authenticity of that. But regardless, for the future of crypto and for the future of thoughtful crypto policy, I think the dialogue around this is strictly good. And, you're not asking for my advice as a sector or anything like that, but I'm give you my armchair 2 cents anyway, is I think part of what you're going to see happen in the country is that interest in crypto becomes not some sort of inward-looking sport, but an issue of mainstream interest that's coming in the coming years. And right now, I think the industry structure is missing the channels to reach the mainstream masses with thoughtful approaches to crypto integration, not just cheerleader rah-rah stuff, but actually thoughtful approaches to modern portfolio theory. Think about efficient frontiers in portfolio construction, classical financial economic theory. How do you incorporate crypto into thoughtful discussion about that? I think that opportunity is going to present itself because precisely of this thoughtful policy discourse so far on the Republican side. But if it happens on the Democratic side, I would, speaking from a partisan or biased perspective, might have questions about the authenticity of it. But speaking just as an impartial observer is going to be strictly good for the future of thoughtful integration of crypto into the future of the country.
All right. And we are going to let you go, Vivek. But the last thing I want to ask you is, you're not a politician, or you're not a politician anymore. You're not in the race anymore.
Barely
you're
was for a year. But
a business person.
Yeah.
What happens from here? Are you going to continue on your political journey? Are you going to maybe work a little bit more in the crypto field? You've lent your voice to support crypto since you started your journey in politics. Like, what are you thinking about doing next?
So, I've lived the American dream in a way at a scale that my parents would have never imagined. It's not like they would have laughed at it. They couldn't have laughed at it because they wouldn't have even imagined this, at the time they came to this country 40 years ago. I'm at a stage in my life and my journey where I feel called to serve in some way, right? I was called to run for president of the United States. And the beauty of this country is that decision belongs to the people. But whatever I do next, it's going to be to serve the country in whatever way I think has the biggest possible impact. Obviously, a lot hangs in the balance for what's going to happen in less than 100 days in November. So I'm not making any firm long-run personal plans, certainly until after that's transpired. I'm working hard to make sure President Trump's reelected and doing my part in not only the top of the ballot, but down ticket races across the country. I kind of missed my life as an entrepreneur. And so in some ways I am dabbling again in certain of the private sector ventures I've been involved with and even some new ones that I'm exploring. But that's more for my own fulfillment and a part of my life that I missed in my year in politics. But the reality is the future I see is one of public service of some form. And what form that takes depends heavily what happens this November.
All right, Vivek, we are going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on our live spaces as we explore the road to the elections in November. Thank you very much. All right, Renato, it is back to just us two. And the last time we spoke, we chatted a little bit about what, we think is going to happen ahead of November. If anyone who's watching this has any ideas or questions they want to ask either of us, please make sure you just put them in the thread below. Our producer will grab them and we'll answer them for you. And if we can't answer them, we'll find a guest who can on a later show. If you are just joining us now, we are live on CoinDesk's Twitter. We are exploring regulation and policy ahead of the elections in November. Renato, you didn't get much of a chance to chat there during our discussion with Vivek, but I want to get your perspective now. Every time you and I talk, we talk about the Polymarket polls. Last time we spoke, Donald Trump was really leading in the Polymarket polls. Bettors were putting their money on Trump. Since Harris has come out as the Democratic nominee, that gap has really started to close. The last I checked, Trump was just over 50%. Harris was just under 50%. What do you make of what's happening or what's happened in the last few weeks?
Well, there's certainly been a huge change. It's been a historic time in our country. It's something that we haven't seen really ever before. We had a change at the top of the ticket this close to the election. And look, I think you could see what that adjustment brings to the table through this conversation with Vivek. Obviously, politicians, like you said, I didn't get a word in edgewise because he's politicians like to talk.
They really do.
But he was saying, look, he didn't know what Harris's plans were in crypto. He expected her to come out with those plans, and he didn't really have a response there. I mean, I think he was actually honest in saying that's a good thing for this industry. I think it is. And I think you're right that there's probably going to be a more forward-looking approach towards this space. But I think what it means is that suddenly it shifted the dynamics of the race. And now I think we don't know for sure exactly what Harris's positions are going to be on every issue because she's just rolling out her campaign. And so I think it's going to make this a very interesting, couple months to come in the run up to the election.
I couldn't have guessed that crypto would have been such a relevant topic, something we were talking about every day ahead of the election. And I agree with what you're saying. I think that it's only good for the industry that we have this discourse. Vivek also said that. I mentioned I've spoken to some of the Congress people on the Democrat side. They seem to really get it. They really want to educate Harris as she builds up her campaign ahead of November. And so I think that this is good. Now, you work with a lot of crypto businesses in the US. How are you advising them to operate ahead of the elections? Obviously, we don't have any legislation. Things are pretty unclear. How do businesses need to look at what's going on and what do they need to look for?
Well, one thing we can't do is get ahead of ourselves. I mean, this is great news. Like you said, it looks like we may have both sides essentially saying that there's going to be movement in, I'd say, the right direction away from regulation by enforcement. That's good. But we don't know. First of all, whenever you're dealing with things that politicians say, it's not something you take to the bank, right? You don't bet your business's future based on the words of politicians in their speeches. But also, it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, one thing I feel like anybody who's watched Washington knows is that nothing there happens quickly. And so, there'll be an election in November. We'll see who ultimately is elected. There's going to be a new administration in place one way or the other, and there's going to be change, but that's going to take some time. And of course, we're going to have potentially, and almost likely, I would say, divided government in some form because you need 60 votes in the Senate to get anything done. So realistically, both parties are going to have to work together. That's always something that I'm skeptical of happening. And so firms need to be prepared for enforcement activity to continue. They need to be prepared for still uncertainty regarding what a regulatory framework is. Although Vivek alluded to it, I haven't seen a comprehensive regulatory framework for crypto coming out of the Republican side either. So I think it's fair to say we don't know exactly what that's going to look like.
The one thing I've heard folks on both sides agree on is that SEC Chair Gary Gensler should be replaced. Although I have also heard some people say, the industry comes so hard at Gary Gensler, but a lot has happened under him. The spot Bitcoin ETF was approved. The spot ETH ETF was approved. Coinbase went public. I know you have very strong opinions. Curious your thoughts when you hear those comments.
I'm not a fan of the approach that Chairman Gensler has taken, because I think whenever you're regulating a space that's new, I mean, it's new and not new at the same time, right? Obviously, Bitcoin's been around for quite some time now, and other digital assets have been around for many years at this point too. But nonetheless, when you're regulating a space that hasn't been regulated before, it makes sense to announce rules of the road in advance instead of just jumping in there with a lot of enforcement activity. I have done, when I was a federal prosecutor, first of its kind prosecutions. It does have its place when what the person is doing is so crazy and out of the mainstream that it makes sense to have an enforcement action. I don't think anybody is complaining, for example, that there was a prosecution of Sam Bankman-Fried at this point. All right, there's a lot of fraud that was there. He was convicted by a jury of his peers, but a lot of what Gensler is doing, I think, is very aggressive. So I do think there's going to be an adjustment. That's a good thing for everybody, no matter what your political view is. And I think it's part of the maturing of this space. I mean, one thing I will say, and I disagree with Vivek on a variety of things. He's bought into some things I would label conspiracy theories.
I think you and I both.
Yeah, you and me both, right? I mean, I don't believe the election was stolen, or that big tech stole the election, or as great replacement theory. A lot of things he's bought into, but I do agree with him that having people who are not naturally inclined to be focused on this space starting to get interested in crypto is a good thing. I think a regulatory framework is a good thing, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. So I'm hopeful, and I'm excited about what change there could be in this space. I mean, I think it's a good thing for our country.
All right. Well, to our audience, if you're just tuning in, we are live every second week right here on Twitter. Renato and I talk to you about regulation and policy. Sometimes we talk about the election. Sometimes we talk about regulatory developments in other aspects of the industry. If you have questions or comments, please tweet them. We will make sure we get to them. Make sure that you're not trolling us. I mean, you can troll us. We just are not going to read them. So if you're trying to do that, good luck to you. It's just you and your keyboard. All right. We have a question. Do you think a regulatory framework in the US would be good for crypto? Renato, I think that you just affirmed that, yes, you think it would, but I wonder if you want to expand on that for our viewer.
Yeah, what I want our viewers to understand is that no matter what the framework looks like, even if it's not very good, even if you're really unhappy with it, knowing what the rules are is always better than having no idea what the rules are, right? If you're driving down the highway and it's one thing to say, okay, the speed limit is 25 miles an hour, that's too slow. Fine, you can at least try to, what the rule is, though, you can try to get it changed. But if you don't know what the rules are, you're just driving and you're getting stopped by cops for no apparent reason, you don't know what the speed limit is, that's a bigger problem. And so companies can plan around rules. They can plan around regulations and frameworks and laws. What they can't plan around is uncertainty. And so I think no matter what comes out of a framework, let's get something in writing. Let's get something passed into law so we can start planning and growing businesses. And then we can work as an industry, potentially to get those laws changed or modified or improved over time.
But that's a really good point you bring up. I know that there are some jurisdictions, countries like Japan, the crypto rules I've heard are very strict and stringent, but at least there are rules and companies have been able to maneuver them. So I think that's a very valid point that we don't always think of when we're thinking of what's going on here in the United States. But Renato, I want to get to our next bulk of stories now because it's all about NFTs and it's all about not knowing the rules, right? So DraftKings is dumping its NFT business because of legal developments. And then there's a separate story that says 2 NFT artists are suing the SEC to get a declaratory judgment that would protect their forthcoming NFT projects from regulatory action against the SEC. I want to talk about the DraftKings story first because these legal developments that they are talking about is a class action lawsuit. And I want to start there. We hear about a lot of class action lawsuits in crypto. How effective are they? I know in this DraftKings example, it seems very effective. It seems like the people who bought into this project are going to get their money back. I think they're going to be refunded for their NFTs, and they were able to get the project taken down for whatever reason. But how effective are class actions in crypto?
Well, they can be effective. It really depends on I think the strength of the individual case, the quality of the attorneys, and so forth. I think in this particular case, what you're seeing is DraftKings faced a ruling by a judge. This was a federal judge in Boston, if I recall correctly, essentially saying, "I am not going to dismiss this at an early stage." And if the judge wasn't going to dismiss it at the very early stage and allow this to go forward, things are going to get very expensive for DraftKings. So just whenever you get to pass a motion to dismiss stage and there's a class action, there's a whole lot of work that has to be done regarding, for example, certification of a class. There's going to be discovery and damages and all sorts of things that are going to come down the road that would have to be not only determined by a judge, but also just the mere legal cost of going through all those stages is very expensive. So DraftKings is looking at this and is like, okay, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Apparently, I don't know, but based on what we've seen publicly, that would be the obvious takeaway here is that they just decided, this business isn't worth it. And so, look, in that sense, this lawsuit was effective, but of course, it does mean now there's one less product in the marketplace, right? And I think that's because what you're seeing here is, just from a legal perspective, to get a very focus on why this, it may be different from some other cases we might talk to today. The Howey test, which is what we've got right now, some court test from many, many years ago, because we don't have a regulatory framework, really
I think almost 100 years, Renato.
Yeah, it's sort of bizarre, but in my view, but there's a require. One of the factors they look at is there a common enterprise, and does the success rely on the efforts of others? And so I think the idea is if you're investing in DraftKings NFTs, you're betting on the success of DraftKings. If DraftKings goes kaput, the value of your NFTs is going to be impacted. I think that was potentially driving things here, and I think you may see a different result in a case that is got potentially different parties in that case.
What does this mean for other NFT projects? Because you say that, and I bet you could argue it way better than me as you sit there in your new lawyer job. But like what you've just said to me, I think can be argued about a lot of different things. And some of the SEC commissioners argued this, Hester Peirce, and one other commissioner argued this when the SEC charged 2 NFT projects last year. So what does this mean for other NFT projects? It seems like because we don't have any clear rule, we got to depend on precedent being set. And is there a precedent set here?
Yeah, I think this is part of the reason why this approach is just a bad approach, as opposed to having a regulatory framework. There can be disagreement about what these factors mean. I mean, if I tell you the Howey test, there's money invested, expectations of profits, common enterprise, success relies on the efforts of others. That can mean different things to you or to me or some of these people that are watching us on Twitter or on YouTube, right? So ultimately, courts are going to decide this, and we don't have clear rulings. So, what that means is the court you're in matters, who you are matters. For example, if these NFTs weren't issued by DraftKings, but were issued by a local artist who has been an artist for decades or something along those lines, you might have a different result. Right? And so I think it's really a case-by-case basis, and it's why, unfortunately, if you're doing business in this space and issuing NFTs, you need the advice of a lawyer. It is what it is.
Well, I think that's a great transition to our next story. 2 artists filed a lawsuit against the SEC, and this time it was in Louisiana, and they want to get a declaratory judgment that their forthcoming NFT project would not violate securities laws. How likely is this? I've heard other crypto projects trying to get these declaratory judgments. Do they stand up? Can't the SEC just come and sue you for something else? I just have kind of lost all faith in the SEC acting according to the rules that have been set.
I think this is a really interesting lawsuit, actually, Jen. This is actually very savvy people deciding that they want to come up with a lawsuit that is going to give them the greatest chance of success against the SEC. So you have 2 people here. There's a law professor and conceptual artist is one of the plaintiffs. Okay, I suspect that may have been the mastermind here, and then a singer-songwriter who are saying, "Hey, we're not DraftKings. We're not some big corporation. We're not out there selling NFTs by the bucket load and making lots and lots of money. We are artists first and foremost." And they file this suit in Louisiana, as you mentioned, which is in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, very hostile to the SEC. In fact, that was the same court that said that the SEC's internal quasi-judicial panels were not constitutional, and the Supreme Court ultimately agreed. So the SEC has been very frustrated with the Fifth Circuit. So this is specifically chosen by these plaintiffs. I think the plaintiffs were chosen specifically to be sympathetic. The jurisdiction was chosen specifically to be very favorable for the plaintiffs against the SEC. And the whole complaint really is comparing them to, like, they have Andy Warhol art in there, and they're like, hey, these are just cutting edge artists, just like Andy Warhol was doing interesting things that people didn't expect, painting Campbell soup cans back in the day. Here you have artists doing something unusual here. It's a very different kind of case than a class action against DraftKings, and I think you don't need to be a lawyer to see that.
Now, we spoke about the cost of legal proceedings when it came to DraftKings. How much would it cost to artists to go and file this suit against the SEC?
It's expensive. I do think here it's cheaper than a class action lawsuit, and let me explain why. Here, there's a very narrow set of facts related to these two conceptual artist, singer, songwriter, or whatever, who are issuing NFTs on a small scale, and they're essentially just asking a judge determine this legal issue on the front end, and that's it. That's what a declaratory judgment is. Essentially, judge to make a declaration regarding the regulation of these specific NFTs. That's a more legal issue, so it's a lower cost. I wouldn't be surprised if these law firms are doing this potentially at a reduced rate to help out the law professor, because it's a very interesting legal issue and a cutting edge legal issue. And I think there's a chance of success here. I actually, if I was at the SEC, I would be concerned about this lawsuit, because I think this one is set up to cause problems for the SEC.
Tell me a little bit more about that. You think that there could be a success here. What does that look like if these two artists succeed? What does that look like for the NFT industry? What does that look like for NFT legislation to come, and potentially how the SEC will have to look at NFTs if this is successful?
Yeah. So, we talked a moment ago, you used the word, I think, Jen, precedent, right? And what precedent is out there? What precedent is when a judge makes a decision about a legal issue. We have some out there now, right? We have a judge who made a decision in Coinbase, and we've had other judicial decisions that have come out and, that have set some precedent that judges can look at, Ripple and so on. That's interesting. But what's happening here potentially is going to be setting new precedent. And that's where I think that is the most interesting, because in the NFT space, the precedent hasn't been very pro-industry thus far. But we don't have, for example, a court of appeals really definitively coming out in front of this issue. And I would think that if you are concerned about the SEC overreach in regulation by enforcement, the Court of Appeals you'd be most interested in weighing in on that would be the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where I clerked 20-something years ago, back when I was young, didn't have gray hair. That oversees Louisiana and that part of the country, because they're very concerned about SEC overreach. So I think there's a real opportunity here to have something that comes out ahead of the other lawsuits that are out there, and then potentially creating an opportunity for an incremental move of precedent in a positive direction. Is that the ideal thing? No, an ideal thing would be a rule that's announced that makes this much easier for everyone. But until that happens, this is the sort of legal chess match that's going to have to be played in order to move the ball in a better direction for NFTs.
I think the one thing we can all agree on is the better thing would be a rule, wouldn't it? It sounds so simple, but yet it's proven so difficult here in the United States. All right. If you are watching us, we are live on CoinDesk's Twitter. We're talking about everything regulation and policy. If you have questions, just put them in the thread below this video and we will get to them. We do have a question, Renato, for you from one of our audience members. They've said, how did Ripple's fight against the SEC set precedent?
I think it was really important. And I think it was important beyond just the legal result of the ruling. It was important because I think it showed the industry that you could take on the SEC and win. One thing that is always a challenge when I represent clients is clients sometimes are afraid to fight the government. In certain circumstances, you have no choice, right? You're indicted for a crime. It's ultimately your freedom versus the government. But for a lot of times in an SEC proceeding, it's about money at the end of the day. The SEC wants to fine you. Maybe they want to shut down a part of your business. And ultimately, business folks are going to be making a decision that's commercial, right? They're going to be thinking about the dollars and cents, which is understandable because the whole point of business is to make money. And here you had Ripple say, look, we're going to be aggressive. We're going to take this on. We're going to go after the SEC on this one. And we're going to try to beat them. And they actually had some real success there, right? The SEC dropped that appeal. And now Ripple is out. I mean, we see I'm sure you see their advertising all over the place. And it's because they achieved this victory and I think they've kind of got themselves into a position where they're not concerned about the SEC coming back at them, right? And that's what happens when it's like in Back to the Future, when you hit the bully once, he doesn't want to come and mess with Marty McFly again.
I want to, this kind of relates to what you're saying there. Do you think we're going to see more of these like preemptive lawsuits as long as there are no clear rules trying to get some kind of something out of the SEC?
Yes. In fact, you've seen them in a lot of different contexts. So, for example, a lot of times in whether hot button social issues on both sides of the aisle, right? Whether it's been in the past on, issues of racial and gender equality or, more recently, let's say on this affirmative action fight on the right, where they were filing suit, very carefully chosen plaintiffs, or they were Asian Americans in a specific against a specific defendant to try to bring that issue to the Supreme Court. My point is that lawyers who are very clever and are trying to move precedent in a direction, if they choose the right plaintiffs in the right court, they can do that. And I think you're going to see people working in that vein. The issue is that a lot of the big players in the industry at the same time are going to be sued by the SEC and sued by the CFTC. And we're going to have to contend with those suits, which are basically, I would say, everyone is facing in this space, or everyone, if they're not facing them now, is concerned about them coming in the future.
One of the artists in the story said that they have in the past reached out to the SEC to request a no action letter for two of his other NFT projects, and it got no response. And I wanted to bring this up because I've heard from many people who work in this industry, not just in the NFT aspect of it, but in other parts of the industry, that they've tried to communicate with the SEC. I mean, we've heard Coinbase say this. They've tried to get information from the SEC. They get no response, and then they're surprised by some enforcement action. Is it surprising to hear that the SEC is so non-responsive to folks in the industry? And maybe draw a parallel for me between this industry and other industries. Like, is the SEC just a non-responsive agency, or is this something that's unique to the industry?
Great question. It's not unique, but I will say that there's not a uniform approach to regulators and how they handle efforts to try to get answers from them in the front end. I represent clients of all stripes in a whole variety of industries across the country. And I face the government in all sorts of contexts against all sorts of agencies. And I always, when I have a meeting with a regulator tomorrow, I always start by thanking them for the opportunity to speak with them, because I know I tell them not everyone gives me this opportunity. And it's unfortunate because really regulators are best when they actually listen to the people they're trying to regulate instead of marching in there all guns blazing. Because sometimes they make decisions that ultimately are not only bad for the person they're going after, but bad for the country, bad for their own agency. And there have been plenty of times where in the past where there have been folks who are trying to start something new or innovative who go to either the SEC or the CFTC asking for these sorts of letters, the same thing that was asked for in this case, and they've received them. I mean, we're here in election season. One of the more famous examples is the Iowa electronic markets was a trading market. You talked about the trading regarding the presidential race. They were pioneering that years ago, and they asked for a no action letter and received it from the CFTC early on, many years ago. And that allowed those markets to exist. They were a precursor to a lot of the markets that we see today. And there, the CFTC took, I would say, an approach that is more reasonable, saying, okay, if you're doing what you say, we won't take action based on that. I think that's a good place to start. And it's unfortunate that the SEC hasn't taken that approach here.
We have this comment from YouTube on the screen. Renato, this user is saying, just write the crypto rules and let companies get to work. Allow a sandbox for the SEC to help US companies. Why is the government hurting US companies? There are a lot of different expletives in there, but I edited them out for the audience. When you and I were at Consensus, we talked to SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce. She has been a long supporter of having one of these regulatory sandboxes for crypto companies to operate in, so that the agency can learn more about these companies, and so that the companies can progress and grow under guidance of the agency. Why do you think that hasn't come to fruition yet?
I will say she was frustrated as well. I thought that was a remarkable conversation, Jen, because she essentially said she thought that people in Washington, D.C. just didn't understand the space, didn't care. They were very smug and painted it with a broad brush. I had alluded to earlier, I talked about the issues that Sam Bankman-Fried had, SBF, and that indictment. I do think that really shifted the conversation in Washington. There were issues about campaign donations, and it became a partisan political issue. And it painted with a broad brush. And the reality is there are fraudsters in all sorts of activities. Okay. There are fraudsters in almost any industry you can imagine. But that doesn't, shouldn't color our view of an entire industry and an entire space. And so, I do think I really applaud the move by a lot of lawmakers to come together in a nonpartisan way, bipartisan way, to try to move that. I mean, you alluded to Ro Khanna, what he's doing. I know he had that get together with Mark Cuban, and there were Republicans there as well, all coming together to say, look, we need to figure this out and come up with a regulatory framework. I think that's 100% where things are moving. The question is just, what are we going to do in the meantime to survive regulation by enforcement, before we get there?
Yeah, that comment from Commissioner Peirce that people in Washington don't care, that is something that really has stuck with me. And I've asked a lot of guests who have come on CoinDesk about that and their thoughts. And I don't know if I'm just hopped up on election hopium, talking to all these folks on both sides of the coin who seem to really agree that we need a better way forward for crypto. But it seems like, given the discourse around the election, that the conversation in Washington is changing. And maybe that was even kicked off by the bipartisan support for Fit 21, which you and I have previously talked about.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there should be a lot of credit there to folks in the industry who put a lot of effort into making that happen. I mean, it was a lot of education, a lot of money, I think, spent, investment in terms of having folks go into Washington and educating lawmakers. And you really saw bipartisan legislation, which is a real step forward. Now, it's not going to get passed this year. And I think you and I talked last time, Jen, about how companies need to realize that, bill isn't a law. If you watched Schoolhouse Rock when you were 11 years old, or something like, you learned that. So it's not going to be a law yet, but I think movement is there. And for all of us, I mean, who are sort of interested in pioneers in a space that a lot of folks in America haven't gotten to yet, or haven't really understood yet. This is, I think, an exciting time because we're on the verge of of, I think, an explosion. Once we have that legislation, I really think this space is going to skyrocket, and I'm excited to see what happens.
I think we got to wrap it up there. Skyrocket to the moon. We're on Twitter. I guess I could say that. Renato, it has been such a pleasure hosting this show with you. To everyone who is watching, thank you so much for your comments, for your questions. We do this every other week. So we won't be here next week, but we will be here the following week at 12 p.m. Come with your questions, come with your comments. We're talking about everything regulation and policy and elections. So thank you so much for joining us. And Renato, thank you again for lending your brain, lending your voice to the